The rain poured in heavy sheets against the windshield as Emily gripped the steering wheel, her knuckles white, her heart pounding in her chest. Baby Oliver, strapped into his car seat, let out a soft whimper, his tiny fingers curling in distress. The storm had come out of nowhere, turning the quiet country road into a treacherous path of slick asphalt and blinding darkness. Her old sedan's headlights barely cut through the downpour. As she squinted, trying to find any sign of shelter, the fuel gauge flickered dangerously close to empty, and panic clawed at her throat. She hadn't meant to be out this late, but she had no choice. She was running from a man who should have loved them, but had turned into something else entirely, something she couldn't escape fast enough. Oliver let out a soft cry, and she reached back instinctively, trying to soothe him, her fingers brushing against his soft cheek just as the tires skidded. Her breath caught as the car fishtailed, her pulse roaring in her ears. She fought for control, but the wheel slid uselessly on the wet road before slamming into something solid. Her body jerked forward, the seatbelt cutting into her chest as the car lurched to a stop. Steam hissing from the hood, silence filled the cabin except for Oliver's growing cries and the relentless pounding of rain. Emily's mind raced. She needed to get out. She needed to find help. Twisting in her seat, she unbuckled Oliver, cradling him against her chest as she pushed the door open, rain soaking through her clothes. Instantly, she stepped onto the slick road, glancing around the dark trees looming on either side. No houses, no lights, only endless shadows, and the storm raging above. Lightning flashed, illuminating something in the distance, an old house, barely visible through the sheets of rain. She had no choice. She had to get there. Holding Oliver close, she started towards the house, her feet slipping in the mud, the cold seeping into her bones. But something made her stop, a sound low and deep, barely audible over the rain. She turned, heart hammering in her chest, and that's when she saw it, a dog standing a few feet away, a large German shepherd, its fur-soaked ears pinned back, eyes locked onto hers. She froze, unsure if it was friend or foe. The dog took a step closer, then another, its muscles tense like it was deciding something. She clutched Oliver tighter, backing away, but then the dog suddenly whipped its head around, growling low, its body shifting protectively in front of her, as if sensing something she couldn't see. Emily's breath hitched. She followed the dog's gaze into the darkness beyond the trees, the storm howling around them, and then her stomach dropped. There, in the shadows, barely visible, was a figure, unmoving, watching. Emily's pulse pounded in her ears as she clutched Oliver closer, his tiny body trembling against her chest. The rain blurred her vision, but she didn't need to see clearly to know the figure was real, standing just beyond the reach of the storm's fury, unmoving, silent, watching. The dog growled louder, its stance rigid, protective, the fur along its spine bristling with warning. Emily's breath came in shallow gasps, her legs shaking from fear and exhaustion. She couldn't turn back. The car was useless, the road empty. She had no choice. She had to reach that house. Swallowing the terror that threatened to paralyze her, she took a step back, the dog moving with her, never breaking its stare from the figure in the trees. Lightning flashed again, for a split second, illuminating a face, pale, gaunt, eyes shadowed beneath the hood of a rain-soaked jacket. Her stomach lurched. She knew that face. She had spent months trying to escape it, the father of her child, the man who had once sworn to protect them, but had become the thing she feared most. Her voice caught in her throat. She wanted to scream, to run, but she knew she couldn't be reckless. Oliver's whimpers pressed against her skin, grounding her, forcing her to stay strong for him. The dog let out a bark, sharp and warning, its body tensing as if ready to lunge. The figure took a single step forward, and Emily felt her heart slam against her ribs. She turned and ran, her boots slipping in the mud, Oliver's weight making it harder to move fast. But she couldn't stop. She had to reach that house, had to get inside, had to get away. The dog bounded beside her, keeping pace, as if it had made a decision to follow, to protect. Thunder cracked above them, rattling the ground as she stumbled up the steps of the old house, her fingers fumbling with the doorknob. It was locked. She turned, pounding against the wood, her voice finally breaking free. Please, please help me, someone's out here. Behind her, the dog's growls grew louder, and then a noise that made her stomach turn, a low chuckle from the darkness. She spun, pressing her back against the door, as the figure stepped out from the tree line, his movement slow, deliberate, as if savoring the moment. You can't keep running forever, Emily." His voice was smooth, sickeningly familiar. The storm howled around them, wind tearing at her drenched clothes, her entire body shaking. She pounded again against the door, Oliver crying harder now, the dog snapping its teeth at the man's slow approach. And then suddenly from inside the house, a noise, footsteps, heavy, purposeful, and then the lock clicked. The door swung open so fast Emily nearly fell backward. She stumbled into the warmth of the house, clutching Oliver, as a strong hand caught her arm, steadying her. Her breath came in ragged gasps, her body trembling from cold fear and exhaustion. She barely had time to register the person in front of her, a man, tall, broad-shouldered, his face shadowed in the dim light, before he moved past her, stepping onto the porch, the dog instantly positioning itself beside him, growling deep and low. Emily turned, gasping for air, as she pressed Oliver against her chest, the heat of the house wrapping around them. But she wasn't safe, not yet. She spun back toward the door, hard hammering as she watched the man outside his stance tense. Unreadable lightning flashed again, illuminating the figure at the bottom of the steps, the father of her child, standing motionless, his hood slipping back, revealing his rain-soaked face, his expression unreadable. But his presence alone sent a fresh wave of terror crashing over her. The stranger in the doorway spoke, his voice calm but firm. "You need to leave now." His tone held no hesitation, no fear, but the man outside only smirked, tilting his head slightly like he was considering something. The wind howled, the trees bending under its force, and then he took another step forward. "I just want to talk, Emily, just want to see my son." His voice was smooth, almost gentle, but Emily knew better, knew the danger behind that tone. She had heard it before, right before everything had fallen apart, before the bruises, before the fear, before she had finally gathered the strength to run. The man on the porch didn't move. The dog beside him let out another low growl, its body tense, coiled. Emily felt Oliver shift against her, his cries quieter now, as if sensing the tension, his tiny fingers gripping the fabric of her shirt tightly. She wanted to scream, to beg the man to make him go away, but her voice was trapped in her throat. Her legs felt weak, like she might collapse right there. Then the stranger in the doorway shifted his weight just slightly and said, "You're trespassing. I suggest you walk away now." There was something in his voice, something colder than the storm itself, and for the first time Emily saw the flicker of hesitation in her ex's eyes. It was brief, but it was there, a crack in his confidence, in whatever twisted control he thought he still had. The dog snarled louder, stepping forward slightly, and the man in the yard clenched his jaw, taking a slow step back. Lightning flashed again, illuminating the scene for just a second, the rain relentless pounding against the porch roof, and then he turned without another word, disappearing back into the storm, swallowed by the darkness. Emily's knees finally gave out. She sank to the floor, Oliver still clutched tightly in her arms, her breath coming in sharp, broken sobs, the adrenaline crashing through her, leaving her weak, exhausted, terrified. The stranger shut the door, locking it before turning to face her, his expression unreadable, but his eyes sharp, assessing. "You need to tell me what's going on," he said, his voice calmer now, but still edged with something serious. Emily could barely form words, barely breathe, but she knew one thing for certain: she wasn't safe, not yet. Emily swallowed hard, trying to steady her breath, her soaked clothes clinging to her body. As she shifted Oliver in her arms, his tiny fingers still clutching her shirt, she looked up at the man standing before her, his face partially shadowed by the dim light inside the cabin. Now that the door was shut, the world outside felt distant, but the fear still coiled deep in her chest. She didn't even know where to begin, how much to say. She had spent so long running, keeping her secrets locked away, but she also knew she couldn't do this alone anymore, not with Oliver, not with him still out there. The dog sat near the door, ears still alert, its watchful eyes flicking between her and the man as if waiting for the next move. The man crouched down to her level, his expression unreadable, but his voice steady. "What's his name?" He nodded toward the baby in her arms. His presence was intense, but not unkind, and in that moment something inside Emily cracked just a little. "Oliver," she whispered, her voice barely stronger than the rain still battering the windows. The man exhaled slowly, rubbing a hand over his jaw, as if piecing things together. "Emily, I don't know what you're running from, but whoever that was back there, he wasn't here to talk, you know." That her body tensed at his words. She knew it too well. He wouldn't have tracked her this far just to talk. He never wanted to talk, he wanted control. and she had taken that from him. The moment she left, Emily tightened her grip on Oliver's small frame, her heartbeat still uneven. "I don't have anywhere else to go." She admitted the words barely above a breath. The man studied her for a long moment, his gaze flicking toward the dog, as if silently consulting it, then back to her. His expression softened just slightly. "Then you stay here for now, we'll figure it out." His words were simple, but they unraveled something deep inside her. She didn't know this man, didn't know if she could trust him, but for the first time in a long time someone wasn't telling her she was overreacting, that she needed to go back, that she was making things worse. She nodded, too exhausted to argue, too desperate to refuse. He stood, offering her a hand. She hesitated before taking it, his grip firm, steady, as he helped her to her feet. "Come on, let's get you both warmed up." As he led her toward the small living room, where a fire crackled in the stone hearth, Emily cast one last glance at the door, at the darkness beyond it, her chest tightening. She knew this wasn't over. He would come back, but for now, for just this moment, she and Oliver were safe. Emily settled onto the worn couch, Oliver still pressed against her chest, his tiny breaths uneven, but slowing as warmth from the fire wrapped around them. The cabin was small, but sturdy, the kind of place built to withstand storms both outside and in. The man moved silently, grabbing a thick blanket from a nearby chair and draping it over her shoulders. She flinched at the unexpected kindness, but didn't pull away. Exhaustion was sinking deep into her bones, the adrenaline wearing off, leaving her body heavy and aching. She looked up at him, finally taking in his features properly. His face was rugged with lines that spoke of a life lived hard, but his eyes were sharp, calculating. He wasn't afraid of what had happened tonight. He had been ready for it. "Who are you?" she finally asked, her voice hoarse from the cold, from fear. The man hesitated for half a second before answering. "Name's Cole. Lived out here a long time. Don't see many people anymore, let alone someone running from trouble." Emily swallowed, tightening her grip around Oliver's small body. "I didn't mean to bring it here. I didn't have a choice." Cole sat down across from her, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. "You don't have to explain everything, not yet, but if he finds you once, he'll try again." Her stomach twisted. She knew that he always did. Cole studied her face for a moment, his gaze unreadable. Then he nodded. "I've dealt with men like him before, cowards who think they own what they've lost. You're safe for now, but we need a plan." Her breath hitched. "Safe for now." Those words shouldn't have made her eyes burn with tears, but they did, because she knew he was right. Her ex wouldn't stop. He never did. The dog curled up near the door, still alert, ears twitching at every small sound outside, a silent guardian. Emily ran a shaking hand through her damp hair, the fire crackling, filling the space between them. "I don't know what to do," she admitted, and for the first time in a long time, she wasn't met with blame or disbelief, just quiet understanding. Cole exhaled. "Then we start by making sure he never finds you again." His tone was calm, but there was something else in it, something edged with steel. She met his eyes, and for the first time in months, maybe even years, she felt something close to hope. Emily swallowed hard, staring into the fire, as Oliver shifted against her, his tiny fingers curling into the fabric of her shirt, the weight of everything pressed down on her. Exhaustion, fear, the crushing realization that no matter how far she ran, he would always be looking for her. Cole was right. If he found her once, he would find her again, unless she did something different, unless she stopped running and started fighting back. The thought sent a shiver through her, not because she wasn't willing, but because she didn't know how. Cole leaned back in his chair, watching her closely. His presence was steady, grounding in a way she hadn't expected. He wasn't panicked, wasn't overwhelmed by the storm she had brought to his doorstep. He was just thinking, calculating. "Emily, I don't know what happened between you and him, but I know the kind of man who shows up in the middle of a storm pretending to be something he's not. Men like that don't just stop." His voice was even, but there was something dark beneath it, something that told her he understood this more than he let on. Emily closed her eyes, taking a shaky breath. "I left him when Oliver was 3 months old," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I thought I could do it quietly, disappear before he noticed, but he did, and every time I settle somewhere, he finds me. He always finds me." Cole was silent for a moment, then he nodded, like that confirmed something he already knew. "You can't keep running forever," he said, and the words made her stomach drop. because she knew it too, knew that no matter where she went she would always be looking over her shoulder, always waiting for the next time he showed up. What choice do I have? She asked, her voice sharper than she intended. Cole didn't flinch. Instead, he glanced at the dog still lying by the door, its eyes half open, but alert, then back at her. You stay here for now. I have supplies, cameras. I can make sure we see him before he gets close next time, and when he does we end it. His words sent a chill through her. She didn't know what ending it looked like. She didn't know how to stop a man who had made it clear that she and Oliver would never be free, but for the first time since she had run, she wasn't alone. She met Cole's gaze, hesitating, then nodding slowly. Okay, she said, barely recognizing her own voice. Okay. Cole nodded once, like they had made a deal, like this was just the first step. You should get some rest, he said. Morning comes fast out here, and we have work to do. Emily wanted to argue, wanted to tell him there was no way she could close her eyes, knowing what was out there, knowing what could come, but the exhaustion was pulling at her, dragging her down. Oliver was already asleep against her, his tiny face peaceful against her chest. She exhaled, slow and unsteady, and for the first time in a long time, she let herself believe that maybe, just maybe, she didn't have to run anymore. Emily didn't remember falling asleep, but when she opened her eyes, the fire had burned low, casting flickering shadows across the cabin. Oliver was still nestled against her, his tiny body warm and safe, but something felt different. The silence wasn't comforting anymore. It was too thick, too expectant. She lifted her head, scanning the room. Cole was still in his chair, but he wasn't relaxed. His posture had shifted slightly, one hand resting on his knee, the other hanging loosely near the knife strapped to his belt, his eyes locked on the door. The dog was tense now, no longer dozing, its ears perked, its body coiled, as if waiting for something. Emily's breath caught in her throat. The air felt heavier, like they weren't alone anymore. She shifted slightly, careful not to wake Oliver, her pulse hammering against her ribs. Cole didn't speak, but when his gaze flicked to her just for a second, she understood. Stay still, stay quiet. She swallowed hard, tightening her arms around Oliver. Cole's hand moved slowly, reaching for the rifle. Leaning against the wall, his movements were deliberate, practiced, the kind of ease that only came from someone who had been in situations like this before. He knew something she didn't, something he wasn't saying yet. Then it happened, a sound so soft it might have been lost in the wind, but she heard it, a slow, deliberate crunch of boots against wet leaves. Someone was outside. Her stomach twisted, her breath shallow as her mind raced. Could it be him? Did he find her already? Was it even possible? The last town had been 3 states away. No one had known where she was. She had paid in cash, kept her head down, but somehow, he always knew. Cole stood in one fluid motion, moving toward the window, pressing his back against the wall. Before peering out, his jaw tightened, his grip on the rifle shifting. He turned to her, his voice low and firm. Stay put, don't move. Emily's throat was dry, but she nodded, her fingers digging into Oliver's blanket. Cole moved toward the door, the dog rising silently at his side, muscles tense, ready. Emily could feel her heartbeat in her skull, the fear crawling up her spine like ice. Then a voice cut through the quiet, low and unfamiliar, male, but not his. She didn't recognize it, but that didn't make her feel any better, didn't make the weight in her chest ease any. Hey, I don't mean any trouble, just got lost out here, was looking for a place to wait out the storm. The lie was smooth, practiced, but something about it was off. Cole didn't answer, didn't move for a long moment. Then he finally spoke, his voice steady. You're a long way from the main road. Emily held her breath, staring at the door, willing it not to open, willing whoever it was to turn around and leave, but the silence stretched on too long. The dog let out the softest growl, barely more than a vibration, but full of warning. The man outside shifted, his boots scuffing against the porch. Then, after a pause, he laughed low and knowing. Yeah, he said, voice too casual, like he knew something they didn't guess. I took a real wrong turn. Emily's grip tightened around Oliver, her nails pressing into the fabric of his blanket, as the man's voice lingered in the heavy air. Something in the way he spoke sent ice curling through her veins. He wasn't lost, he wasn't looking for shelter, he was testing the waters, waiting for a reaction. Cole didn't move from his spot by the door, his hand steady on the rifle, his stance unreadable. But Emily saw the way his jaw tightened, the way his eyes flicked to the side, like he was mapping out every possible outcome. You should head back the way you came, Cole said finally, voice calm but firm. There's nothing for you here. A pause, then the man shifted again, his boots scraping lazily against the wood of the porch like he had all the time in the world. "See, that's the thing," he drawled, still too casual, like he was enjoying himself. "I think maybe there is something for me here." Another pause, deliberate stretch too long, his words hanging between them, like a trap, before he finally added something, or someone. Emily's stomach lurched, her breath coming too fast. She could feel Oliver's small weight against her, his warmth grounding. But fragile, she felt exposed, like the walls of the cabin weren't enough, like the storm outside wasn't nearly as dangerous as the one standing on the porch. Cole's fingers curled tighter around the rifle. His voice didn't change, but there was something harder in it now. "You need to turn around and leave now." The man didn't answer right away, but Emily swore she could hear the faintest smirk in his silence, like he was savoring the moment, like he knew the fear clawing at her throat. Finally he exhaled a slow, exaggerated sigh. "Well, that's a shame. Figured maybe we could talk, maybe you could be reasonable about this. But I guess we're doing it the hard way, huh?" Before Emily could process what that meant, there was a sudden creak of movement outside, fast, deliberate. Cole moved instantly, stepping back slightly, his rifle raising in one smooth motion. The dog let out a low growl, fur bristling, hackles raised. Emily pressed herself deeper into the couch, her heartbeat a frantic drum against her ribs. Oliver shifted in her arms, but didn't wake. She forced herself to stay still, forced herself not to panic, but every muscle in her body was screaming at her to run. Then, just as quickly as it started, it stopped. The air went deadly still, no movement, no sound, like the forest itself was holding its breath. Emily barely dared to inhale, straining to listen. Then soft, barely audible footsteps retreating, fading into the storm. Then gone. Cole didn't lower the rifle right away, his eyes still locked on the door, still waiting after what felt like forever. He finally exhaled, stepping back, his shoulders still tight, but his voice controlled. "For now, he's gone." Emily's body sagged with the weight of it, but she knew better than to believe it was over. Gone wasn't the same as safe. Gone meant waiting for the next time, the next move. Cole turned to her, gaze steady but serious, his next words making her stomach drop. "He'll be back." Emily's throat tightened as she clutched Oliver closer, the heat of his small body against her chest the only thing anchoring her in place. Her mind was already racing. What did he want? Why was he here? Was it him? Had he finally caught up to her? Or was this something else, something worse? Cole was already moving, securing the door, checking the window locks, his every motion deliberate, focus controlled. He had done this before, that much was clear, and yet nothing about him looked relieved. He knew just like she did that this wasn't over. The dog stood rigid by the door, ears forward, muscles tense, as if waiting for a threat that hadn't fully revealed itself yet. Emily could hear the storm outside, wind howling through the trees, rain pelting against the roof. But all she could think about was the way the man had spoken, his voice laced with something smug, something patient, like he wasn't worried, like he was just playing a game. Cole turned to her, his voice low. "We need to be ready, you understand?" Ready for what? She whispered, already knowing the answer, but needing to hear him say it anyway. He didn't hesitate. "Ready for when he comes back, and he will come back." Emily swallowed hard, her grip on Oliver tightening. She had spent so long running, so long looking over her shoulder, never staying anywhere too long, never trusting anyone fully. But now, she had nowhere left to go. Even if she did, she knew in her gut that running wouldn't work this time. She met Cole's gaze, forcing herself to stay steady. "What do we do?" His answer was simple, but heavy. "We make sure he doesn't get the chance to try again." Something in the way he said it sent a shiver through her, not fear exactly, but something close. She had no doubt that Cole meant what he said, and for the first time since this nightmare started, she felt something that almost resembled hope, not because she wasn't afraid, but because for once she wasn't alone. Emily took a shaky breath, forcing herself to focus. Oliver stirred in her arms, letting out a small sigh, his tiny fingers curling against her sweater. She pressed a kiss to his soft hair, grounding herself in his warmth, in the quiet rise and fall of his breath. But she knew that quiet wouldn't last. Cole was already moving, checking the rifle, loading more shells into the chamber, his movements precise, methodical, like this was second nature to him. She watched him, her pulse still racing. She should be terrified, but instead, she felt something else, a strange sense of trust, like despite everything, this was a man who knew how to protect, who wouldn't just stand by and let something happen. "We can't stay here," she said finally, her voice steadier than she felt. Cole glanced at her, brow furrowing. "You think running's gonna stop this? It won't." She knew he was right, but the thought of staying sitting still waiting for that man to come back made her stomach turn. "I can't let him find us. I can't let him." Her voice cracked just slightly, but she swallowed it down. Cole's expression softened just enough before his jaw tightened again. "We're not running, but we're not waiting either. If he comes back, we end this here." Emily shuddered, but nodded. She didn't want to be weak anymore. She didn't want to keep running, keep hiding, keep waiting for the next inevitable moment. When he found her again, Cole moved past her, grabbing a duffel bag from the corner, tossing supplies inside: extra ammo, a flashlight, a hunting knife, a thick coil of rope. She didn't ask what for. She didn't want to know what he had planned. If it came to that, the dog still stood by the door, unmoving, its ears flicking at the sounds of the storm, but its focus never shifting. Cole turned back to her, meeting her gaze. "You need to rest," he said, but she shook her head. "Not a chance." He sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. "I get it, but you're no good to your kid. If you can't keep your eyes open, you sleep. I'll keep watch." Emily hesitated, but the exhaustion was already pulling at her limbs. She wasn't sure how long it had been since she'd last closed her eyes more than a few hours at a time. She nodded, slowly curling up on the couch, Oliver tucked safely against her chest. Cole pulled a blanket over them, his touch surprisingly gentle, before stepping away, rifle in hand. The last thing she saw before exhaustion pulled her under was the steady way he stood by the door, watching, waiting, ready for whatever came next. Emily woke to the sound of rain hammering against the cabin windows, the wind howling through the trees. The storm had only grown stronger, a relentless force outside that mirrored the anxiety building inside her. She blinked, groggy, as she slowly came to her senses, trying to shake the fog of sleep from her mind. The room was dim, lit only by the low, flickering fire in the hearth. Oliver was still asleep in her arms, his small face peaceful despite everything. For a moment, the world felt quiet again, as if the threat of the outside world had somehow faded with the dawn. But then she saw Cole, standing rigid by the window, rifle in hand, his eyes scanning the dark outline of the trees. The dog stood beside him, ears forward, tail tense, every muscle in its body coiled. Emily's heart stuttered, and she felt her breath catch in her chest. She knew that look. It was the same look he had worn the night before, when the stranger had first arrived, and she knew it meant they were waiting. She pushed herself into a sitting position, careful not to wake Oliver, who shifted slightly but remained asleep in her arms. She felt a pang of guilt for waking up when Cole had already been up for hours, but she didn't dare question it. He knew what needed to be done. As if sensing her gaze, Cole turned slightly, his eyes meeting hers. They were steely, unreadable, but there was something else, something softer there, something unspoken. He didn't ask her to sleep anymore. He just gestured for her to stay quiet, to stay low. She nodded. He didn't need to explain. She understood. The man would be back. She couldn't explain how she knew, but she felt it deep in her bones. She had spent too long running from him, from the danger that haunted her, to not recognize that feeling. It wasn't just fear. It was something colder, more calculated. He wasn't just coming for her. He was coming for them. She couldn't let him take Oliver. She couldn't let him destroy everything she had fought for. Cole took a breath, looking out the window again before lowering his rifle. He crossed the room quietly, moving toward the door, the dog still by his side. Every movement was deliberate, precise, and Emily knew they were preparing for something they couldn't avoid anymore. The calm before the storm was over. "Stay with him," Cole said quietly, glancing back at her for the briefest moment. She nodded again, pressing Oliver closer to her chest. His small hand grasped her finger instinctively, a small comfort, a reminder of why she had to stay strong. The next few hours passed slowly. Emily watched as Cole moved from window to window, checking the perimeter of the cabin, ensuring all was secure. Every sound outside the cabin made her tense, her heart racing, but nothing came. It was almost as if the storm had swallowed the world whole, leaving them in a tense, suffocating silence. Even the dog seemed to sense it, its eyes never leaving the door, its body perfectly still. Then, just as the tension reached its breaking point, a knock came at the door. It was so soft, so hesitant, that Emily almost thought she imagined it. But then it came again, louder this time, more insistent. Her breath caught in her throat. She looked at Cole, who had frozen at the sound, his hand hovering near his rifle. His eyes flicked toward her, then to the door. There was no hesitation in his movements as he reached for the handle, slowly turning it. The dog growled softly, its teeth bared, as if it could sense the danger even before Cole opened the door. The storm had become a torrential downpour, sheets of rain cascading down from the sky, soaking everything in its path. And standing on the doorstep, drenched to the bone, was the last person Emily had expected to see. It was the man from the night before. He stood there, drenched, his expression unreadable, but his eyes were cold, calculating, like he was already planning his next move. "I told you I'd be back," he said, his voice low and eerily calm. "You're not going to get away from me this time." Emily's heart dropped. She wanted to scream, to run, to do anything to protect Oliver, but she was frozen in place, every instinct screaming at her to get away, to hide. She glanced at Cole, who was standing beside her now, his rifle in hand, the dog growling steadily at his side. He wasn't intimidated. In fact, he looked more focused than ever. "Leave," Cole said, his voice hard, uncompromising. "Now!" The man smirked, his gaze flicking between Emily and Cole, a twisted amusement in his eyes. "You think I'm just going to walk away? You have no idea who you're dealing with." The air between them was thick with tension, the space between life and death hanging by a thread. Emily knew she couldn't wait any longer. She couldn't stand by and let this man come any closer to her son. She had already run too far. She had already sacrificed too much. There was no running left. Without thinking, she stood up, placing Oliver on the couch, and moved toward the door. Cole looked at her in surprise, but didn't stop her. He knew what she had to do. "Get away from my family," she said, her voice shaking with fury and fear. She didn't know where the courage came from, but it surged within her. She wasn't going to let this man destroy what she had built. Not now, not ever. The man's smirk faltered, and for a split second, Emily saw something like hesitation in his eyes. But it was gone in an instant. His hand moved toward his side, and she knew the fight was about to begin. Cole moved faster than Emily could react, his rifle raised. "Get down!" he shouted at her, and Emily dove toward the floor just as the first shot rang out. The storm outside raged harder, drowning out the sound of the world as it exploded around them. The fight for their lives had begun.